Hey friends, welcome to another video. With ClayCon come and gone, I'm currently working on putting the leftover new stock in my online store. But I thought that the footage might be too repetitive for another studio vlog, so today I want to share with you my experience of trying air dry clay for the first time. I got the cheapest clay I could find, which was air dry clay from Kmart at $3.25 per 500 grams. I also bought a cutting mat, a clay tool set, sandpaper, gloss clay varnish, magnets, glue, and a respirator mask. I didn't want to use the clay all at once. Since it's air drying, any exposure would make it harden, so I cut pieces of it with a metal ruler. Straight from the packet it was quite hard, so I spent some time just kneading and moulding it. I realised I needed some water nearby too, so I grabbed a spray bottle to keep the clay damp and pliant and a rag for cleaning up any messes. To be honest, I didn't know what I was doing. I tried rolling the clay out using various tools, but the clay kept sticking to it, so I gave up on that and decided to just use my hands in the meantime. I wanted to try and make simple designs since it was my first time and opted for magnets because I've been seeing a lot of cute ones around and I like that they're both practical and decorative. While I was shaping the magnets, it was quickly becoming very messy and there was already a lot of dust just from handling the clay, so I had to frequently wipe the surface to keep it clean. One of my goals for 2025 is to try a new medium, and since I've been following some amazing clay and ceramic artists, I decided to give air dry clay a go. Initially I wanted to try ceramics or polymer clay, but getting into ceramics seemed very expensive, and when I was looking into polymer clay, it felt a bit overwhelming trying to decide on what colours to buy, which clay was the best, and learning how to bake it properly. Air dry clay was the most cost effective and required the least amount of decision making. It also wasn't until recently that I realised there were so many things you could make with it. Honestly, my first impression of air dry clay was that it's very beginner friendly. I felt like you didn't need a very high level of technical skill or a lot of knowledge to make a finished product with it, which was perfect for experimenting. Continuing on, I tried my best to smooth out bumps with just water using my fingers, but a lot of the magnets were pretty lumpy in the end. Every time there were cracks, I would get a small piece of clay and try to fill it in. I think it worked most of the time. I ended up using only one tool out of the whole tool set to try and refine the sides and corners of my shapes and fill in the cracks. It's probably also a bit obvious, but I only realised after a little while that I didn't need to always use my hands to mould the shapes, and I was able to cut the clay using tools, which made it a lot easier to create neat shapes. I'm not sure if I should have used my respirator mask or not for this stage, but there was a lot of dust, which I did become concerned by, so maybe I will next time. Here are the completed shapes I have so far. You can see they're pretty lumpy, but I was hoping sanding them would help flatten the surfaces. I should mention that this magnet making took place under multiple sessions. I actually started them last December, but didn't have time to finish them until recently. At this point, the magnets had been drying for literally over a month, but I finally found some time to sand them. I definitely used the mask this time. There were instructions on the package, so it wasn't difficult to work out how to assemble it. But honestly, I hated wearing it. Like, I know it's for my protection, but once I had it on, it really felt like my breathing was restricted. I started sanding with 600 grit sandpaper because that was the lowest one I had in my stack. The clay really felt like chalk when I was sanding it. I could tell it was making a big difference to the surfaces. If I sanded enough, I'm confident I could have made them really flat and smooth, but I didn't want to take off so much clay because it would have made the magnets a lot thinner and I was afraid they might crack. Regardless, sanding still gave the magnets a smoother feel and I was able to neaten out the edges and bevels. I noticed that the clay was using up the sandpaper really fast, and this might be kind of dumb, but I had no idea if I could reuse it or not since I haven't used sandpaper very often. I ended up rinsing the clay off it and reused the same pieces a few times to sand all of the pieces until I was happy with them, and this managed to work. And then it was time to paint. I'm using some acrylic paints that I already have. This was actually the most time-consuming process. It took longer to paint the magnets than it did to mold or sand them. I think this was due to my indecision. I had a general idea of what I wanted to make, but apart from that, I didn't know which colors I wanted to use or which details I wanted to paint. I also noticed that when the paint dried, it would create a layer sitting on top of the clay and kind of crack around the edges, meaning that I could pull all of the paint off in one piece, kind of like when you have PVA glue on your hands and you peel it off after it dries. This concerned me, but I didn't feel like I could do much about it. I was hoping that putting the varnish on later would help seal the edges and paint. A lot of my time was spent just mixing colours and repainting bits I had already painted because I didn't feel like they were bright enough or matched well. Since the clay was terracotta coloured, it probably influenced the way my paint looked on top of it. I really wanted to get the clay in white, but unfortunately they didn't have it in stock at the time, and I didn't want to wait. In retrospect, maybe I should have painted the pieces white first or used some sort of primer before adding the paint so that it was more vibrant. Sometimes I went over the design 2 or 3 times before I was happy with it, which unfortunately added unwanted texture to the surfaces. Since I mainly do digital illustrations, I was also trying to translate my style into this new medium. I wasn't sure how it would turn out, and the painting took multiple sessions. I felt like I needed fresh eyes each time to decide on how to paint the details. I added little faces to some of the magnets because they felt too plain, and also added little marks to give them more detail. This kind of imitates how I draw, and I was happy to transfer that into this new medium. In the end, I was hoping that the paint would cover up a lot of the bumps and messiness of the clay, but they're still very visible. Regardless, I was quite happy with how I painted them in the end. And then it was time for the last steps. Varnishing first. This clay varnish I'm using is also air drying. I don't need a UV light or to mix any chemicals to cure it, which is exactly what I want for my first time. A nice, easy process. I started with a thin layer of varnish. I struggled to hold the pieces while I was varnishing them, but ended up putting a thin coat on all of them eventually, while holding them with another paintbrush. The varnish gave them a glossy finish. Unfortunately, one of the magnets got ruined when I tried to varnish it. I think the paint wasn't dry enough, so it smudged the design. I was able to fix it up mostly, but this specific magnet has been the most challenging throughout the entire process. I wanted to add a second coat of varnish and seal the edges of the paint, but they were difficult to hold and maneuver. I decided it was time to add the magnets so that they could be lifted from the table and I could reach all the sides without touching it. I'm using this Uhu all-purpose adhesive to glue the magnets on. These magnets were honestly pretty strong, maybe even a little too strong. When I was looking to buy magnets on Amazon, I found plenty with bad reviews, so I was a bit nervous that they'd be weak, but I noticed they would slowly pull towards each other while they were still drying. Because of this, I had to keep an eye on them and recenter them a few times. Something I learned after the whole process is that I also needed to make sure the magnets were glued on in a consistent way, making sure I was facing the same sides to the back of the magnets. Otherwise they would stick to each other and separate from the clay piece because the magnets were a lot stronger than the glue. After I attached the magnets, I added another coat of varnish and tried to seal the paint on the back. The whole varnishing and gluing process was messy. I noticed if the varnish was too thick, it would goop up and dry that way, and the glue was super stringy, so some of the magnets have glue strings on them. There were also small specks of paint and dust that got sealed with the varnish, unfortunately. Here are the completed magnets. This was a really fun learning experience. While I love doing small business stuff, sometimes I miss using my hands to make art. Next time I definitely want to sketch out my ideas before I start making them to save time. If you can believe it, it took me 25 hours to make these, which I think is a very long time. I also want to find a way to make the tops less bumpy during the molding process, make the paint smoother, and be more careful about applying glue and varnish. Once I improve my technique, I'm hoping to make more complicated items and maybe even add a few things to my store. I hope you enjoyed this little process video, and if you have any tips on using air dry clay, please let me know in the comments below. In the meantime, I'll see you in the next video. Bye!